Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. This is Season 5, Episode 12. Today I'm talking to journalist Peter Sussman, who has written two books, Committing Journalism, and his second book, Decca, The Letters of Jessica Mitford. Peter is an artist here in the San Francisco Bay Area locally, and he was a writer for the San Francisco Chronicle for several years. And I'm just going to go ahead and go into the conversation with journalist and author Peter Sussman. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Podcast. My name is Dean Jones and I'm the Well Seasoned Librarian, and today I am talking with author and artist Peter Sussman. Peter, thank you for being on the program.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, Peter, for our listeners who are not familiar with your background, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a born Easterner, but have lived here since, well, for almost 60 years, I guess. And I'm Berkeleyan. I worked for 30 years for the Chronicle as an editor in various capacities, and then left and did some freelance and contract writing and wrote two books, one co-authored with a prison writer and the other a book of letters, which we'll talk about later. And you use the word artist. That's something new for me. I discovered photography in the last decade or two and have become increasingly passionate about it. And it's a big part of who I am now. I'm also, I don't know what scope you have for this question, but I'm also a husband, a father or grandfather, and I've been involved also in a lot of civil liberties and social justice issues.
Now, when you work for the San Francisco Chronicle, you held a number of editing positions. Can you tell us about some of them?
Yeah, I started out on the copy desk, which is where one writes the headlines, captions, and does the close-up editing, trimming stories that won't fit, asking questions. I went from there to the news desk, essentially assistant news editor. And at that time at the Chronicle, there were two assistant news editors who split up the paper. One took the national and world pages, the other took the local pages, and decided what would run, how the stories would look, drew out the pages on what's called the dummy sheet, a grid of the paper, which then went to the printers, decided what headlines to give, what stories to run with each other, decided what pictures to run and crop, and just assembled the whole paper, saw what we had room for on any particular day. And occasionally I was the news editor, which involved page one and general oversight. And then after a number of years doing that, I went to the Sunday sections and edited for a year a old section called This World, a general interest magazine on newsprint. And after that to Sunday Punch for 10 years, which was a kind of quirky Sunday section of commentary, essays, humor, columns, and editorial and so forth. And left there after 30 years at the Chronicle.
I worked in newspapers myself, and I know that you're always working against multiple deadlines usually, and
Yes.
It's very stressful. Did you find it to be a very stressful environment?
It was tremendously stressful, and it's a young person's game. You've got to be adaptable. I was there for, essentially I was the funnel point in the process when I was on the news desk, so that all the stories from usually from the city desk, which meant all the local and metropolitan stories, would funnel through me and then out to the various copy editors. And if I thought a story was worth page one, I would kick it over to the news editor. So every story had to pass through me. And in those days, it wasn't an electronic setup, it was paper. So stories that were coming on deadline were being written as I was putting them through the editing process, which meant that they arrived page by page. And I had to keep track of each page of each story, each minute. And you're right, there were several editions. The first one we were done with by dinner time, and that went to Northern California, Southern Oregon, Tahoe by truck. And then there was another major edition. There were minor editions in between. There was a major edition about 10:30 at night. We were finished with about 10:30, 11. That was went to most of the homes around the Bay Area. And then later editions, as news developed, were what were called chasers. And those went to San Francisco, downtown, and home. And so, yeah, it was tremendously stressful. You were always on your feet. You were weighing one story against another, see which one you'd give better play to. But, I learned a tremendous amount about integrating different stories and facets, which is what we do in a life. We have a lot of storylines that we're working on at once. I learned specifically in relation to photography, I learned how to handle photos, and these days that's all done by a photo editor.
Yeah, right.
In my day, it came directly from the head photographer to my desk, and I decided whether to run it and how. So I learned how to crop a photo, how to treat it. I mean, photos tell stories, and if you position them in a certain, if you crop them in one way, you're telling a different story than if you crop it another way. It depends on how much background you include and so forth. We've all learned this subsequently at the Trump inauguration, when he took issue with the photos that were run, saying they were misleading because they showed so much empty space.
Right.
And in fact, that's the way those photos are usually taken. And there was a lot of empty space, but he would have preferred a tighter crop that didn't show the empty spaces. So you're telling different stories depending on how you crop a photo. So I did learn almost inadvertently, without realizing I was learning. I learned a lot about photography there. But by and large, I was, I enjoyed it. It was a powerful job because, I was determining what people read and what emphasis it had, whether it was top of the page with a large headline or down below with a smaller one, which stories were with each other, because stories reverberate on a page. And if you see several, say, police shootings on the same page, you may get a different impression than if you see them scattered in different sections of the paper. So you were helping shape the world for people every day, and it was stressful, but it was also often exhilarating.
What do you think of, I grew up with newspapers, and I have a great love and affection for newspapers and journalism and journalists. I follow many journalists throughout the years, and I really miss being able to get my news from that. And nowadays it seems like everything is coming from little micro reporting on social media. What you've seen, I think, a great shift in your lifetime. What do you think of the current way we get our news, from little microbytes on social media?
Yeah, I agree. When I grew up, my parents subscribed to, I think, 4 newspapers. Two were from my town of about 15,000. 2 were New York papers, one which my father took with him to work and read on the train, and the other stayed home with my mother. It's New York Times and the Herald Tribune. And then there was a daily afternoon regional paper, Newsday.
Yep.
And so those were all the newspapers, not to mention the magazines. entirely different now. I still am, I'm the last person to subscribe to the Chronicle um, in paper, but I also check it online, and I get my information from many news sources. And I worry a lot about news literacy because there are many wonderful silos of information around the web, including, you can find sites on economics, on politics, Politico or The Hill, or investigative journalism, and there are all kinds of wonderful sites, but but anyone can be a publisher. That's the name of the game. And
Yeah.
so I worry about news literacy. I worry that, and we've seen the effects with, among other things, the Trump presidency, of people getting their information and not understanding how to interpret it, or how to what its credibility or trustworthiness is. So I worry a lot about that. Trust, I think, these days is a very important issue in journalism, credibility. And there are efforts underway, one by a friend of mine called the Trust Project, to evaluate different outlets in terms of reliability. But those are tricky too.
Yeah.
Every site has a spin, and spin is legitimate. Thomas Paine was hardly a objective reporter, but we do have freedom of the press, and it's wonderful. But we also journalists have to discipline themselves as well. And I've done a lot of work with journalism ethics in that area. I was on the ethics committee for many years of the Society of Professional Journalists, and worked to hone the ethical assumptions that journalists operate with, and that I hope readers judge them by.
Yeah.
But we need to teach news literacy. We need to teach that anyone can say anything they want on the web. And, some of this stuff is, we talk about fake news. Some of it is just crazy conspiracy theories. This, Q, which no one even, they're doing things, making life and death decisions based on something that they don't even know who comes from, someone they don't even know who. Q, someone named Q, maybe, who may or may not exist, and maybe schizophrenic. Who knows? He may be completely off his mind. But you get a kind of a cluster response, and people reinforce each other's enthusiasm, and it just gets out of hand. That these things are so removed from any normal evaluative process. It's crazy. But that's determining our politics, among other things. So yes, it's a terribly important problem, and I think we all need to become skilled news consumers. And maybe this kind of thing, what do you trust online ought to be, and how do you evaluate it ought to be part of every curriculum, just the way history and math and science are.
While you were at the Chronicle, you co-authored your first book, Committing Journalism, The Prison Writings of Red Hog, with a prison writer named Dennis M. Martin. And how did you come to write this book, and how did you get to meet up with Martin?
Danny was his name, not Dennis. Danny Martin.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So it was published just before I left the Chronicle in 1993, late 93. Danny's letters came to me. He was his articles. He was a bank robber and over many years, and a lifelong heroin addict who grew up in the Central Valley in a poor area among what we sometimes refer to as Okie population around near Fresno. And high school dropout, and was on drugs of some kind most of his life, and in and out of prison all his life, until the end. And until almost the end, a few years before he died. And he was an amazing guy. He had always wanted, I learned all this later. Well, let me just start with what happened. He submitted a letter to me in 1986, a submission for publication in the section I edited called Sunday Punch. And he submitted this article about AIDS in prison. And at that time, AIDS was a new thing. No one had thought about the implications for prisoners, where they were living close together with all of the risk factors like shared needle use and
Right.
sex and so forth. And so it was an epidemic within the prison. People were dying. The prison didn't know how to deal with it. They kept people together. The prisoners had no guidance, and they felt abandoned. They felt they were abandoned to die there. And Danny wrote an article just to alert the world to what was going on. There was the first article I'd seen on AIDS in prison. It made sense, just the way pandemic and a cruise ship makes sense, but no one had commented on it. And so this was this population that really didn't have much communication with the outside world. And I had always been interested in publishing, and I made this a kind of hallmark of the section I edited, publishing viewpoints and voices that were out of the mainstream, that we just don't hear about, that don't have a voice, they're voiceless. And so I was predisposed to that sort of thing. But usually when prisoners write articles, and submit them to papers, they are self-justifying. I didn't do the crime or whatever, or they are just crazed writings of someone who's mentally ill. So you'll get page after page after page after page of small handwriting gibberish.
Right.
And so those are the things I usually get. This was articulate, beautifully written. And I checked it out with and by the way, this was at a time when no one had thought, I mentioned that no one had thought about AIDS in prison, but it was like 6 months later that Newsweek had a cover story on AIDS in prison. So it was that far in advance of the curve. And it was beautifully written. I was stunned. It came from a federal prisoner in Lompoc, California. That's all I knew, Lompoc Penitentiary. I checked it out with our AIDS reporter, Randy Schultz, celebrated AIDS reporter, and he was as impressed with it as I was, and just to make sure it was technically correct and so forth. And then I published it, and the readers were very excited about it. It was, an authentic voice from inside the prison. Danny had never published anything before, had never submitted anything before. And he wrote follow-up letters saying, gee, that was a wonderful experience. Do you mind if I send you other stories? I said, no, not at all. I will evaluate each of them on their own merits, as I do any freelance article, and they'll be treated like any freelance article. So some I may accept, some I may reject, some I may edit, but I'd be happy to hear more from you. And that started a string of, I think, close to 50 articles that he sent me over a number of years.
Wow.
And the readers were very supportive. They loved to hear I used to get calls saying, is there going to be anything, before I buy the paper, is there going to be anything by that prisoner in this coming week's Sunday Punch? And then after 2 years of doing this, I finally decided to meet him. Our names were put together, and LA Times did a piece on what we were doing. And I wasn't prepared for that. I was just publishing his article. I wasn't prepared for the fact that this was becoming a phenomenon. So I went down after a year of his writing for me, I think it was. I went to meet him in person. I flew down to Santa Barbara, and we had a nice visit. And in the course of the visit, he said, there's been a lot of tension in this prison because of things that the administration is doing, mainly to piss off the prisoners and exercise control or demonstrate that they are in control. And it's causing a lot of resentment, and that sort of thing usually often leads to riots.
Right.
Why do you have to wait until a riot occurs to deliver your grievances to the press, which prisoners always do? Yeah. Why can't you talk about them in advance? I said, you can. Write it up for me. Tell me what's going on. He wrote that article. I published it, and he was immediately sent to the hole. Now, Danny was a very realistic guy, and he understood that this was a possibility. So he had arranged for another prisoner to call me collect. I always had to hear from him collect. He said, if you get a call from someone named such and such, it means I'm in trouble for my writing. So I was called by this person, and I immediately went to work trying to protect him and to find out what was going on. He was incommunicado until a few days later. I received a mail which he could get out because it was sent media mail, which is unread, it's unopened, and it's labeled media mail, which is the same kind of category as lawyer mail.
Right.
And he said, I've just got this stub of a pencil that some prison staffer has given me. I can't, some inmate has given me. I can't communicate with you in any way, but this is just to alert you. Meantime, I had been trying to protect him by publicizing the fact that he'd been put in the hole for some story that I had chosen to run. Basically, he was being punished for something I did.
Jesus.
And that's a violation of freedom of the press. And it's obviously very dangerous for the prisoner himself, who could be punished severely for it. And but I wanted to protect him, and the best way I knew to protect him was to publicize it. So I did alert a number of news outlets and the Chronicle itself, and they started doing stories on it. Next morning, I was out on a morning run, and a neighbor who was a lawyer was out, and I said to him, hey, how do I stand legally? I've just, this is what's going on, and I've declared full-throatedly that this is a violation of the First Amendment. And, but I don't know all the case law with the First Amendment. He said, oh, it's very interesting, and so forth. And then when I got home from my run, he was on the phone, and he said, I've read the story now, and you have a hell of a case. This is important. I can convince my firm to represent Danny pro bono. Are you interested? And I said, absolutely. I want to protect them. So we already had a attorney, and we filed a suit. And then the prisoners had all complained because they were outraged. They had been so proud of what Danny was doing. All the prisoners at other prisons were passing the story from cell to cell, the stories from cell to cell every time he wrote. And then I heard one report that they would stash it behind the phone where any of the prisoners could find it and return it like one of these street side libraries these days.
I like that.
Yeah, it was a phenomenon within prisons because they had a voice. Someone was listening to them. The stories were not, by and large, earth-shattering. They were mostly just about life inside prison. And I had heard nothing from the prison authorities for the first year. And in fact, one of the stories which he had written, which was about guards, had been so favorably received that we were told that the guards had posted it in their break room. So they were excited about it. Everyone knew about it at the prison, and it was useful. And Danny's article about guards was not confrontational thing. He basically said that they're as trapped by their role in this prison as we are as prisoners. And so anyhow, he was under pressure. He was released from solitary confinement and began to write, and wrote with me, wrote and then edited with me a article on what happened to him, which is an example of how things work in prisons when someone speaks out on injustices. And that article, we feared would get him transferred or otherwise punished, because what the prison likes to do is, federal prisons like to take troublesome prisoners, or ones they considered troublesome, and pass them from prison to prison in quick succession, so that it takes them a while to gain their phone privileges and everything else and arrive in a new prison, and for people to know where they are. And they basically try and lose them in the system.
Right.
The prisoners refer to it as the merry-go-round or bus therapy, where you're sent from prison to prison.
Yeah.
So Danny was fearful of this, and he alerted us that this is what they'll probably be doing. The ACLU was involved because all the prisoners had complained to the ACLU, and they called me and offered representation. So we already had two attorneys, my neighbor and the ACLU attorney. And then we wanted to get the Chronicle involved because they were the institution that published the story and got punished for it, and for which the writer got punished. And we didn't hear from them at first, and we wrote up the lawsuit to protect his First Amendment rights and the rights of our readers, and to read what he had to say. And as a result, the Chronicle did decide to join, so we now had a third attorney. So it became a major legal case and drew national attention. And at the first hearing, the judge, we had said they're going to move him any day and try and hide him. And the judge said, okay, let me call a 7 a.m. court hearing just to forestall this, if that's what they have in mind. At the hearing, he asked the Department of Corrections, the Federal Bureau of Prisons attorney, if they were indeed going to move him, and the attorney said yes, and judge said where, and he said, well, first to Phoenix. And so everything Danny said was confirmed. They were going to try and lose him in the system by bussing him around the country. And the judge asked the attorney, when will this transfer take place? And the attorney said, this morning. So the judge said, all right, you can transfer him to Phoenix, but he stays there and until the end of this court case. And that at least stabilized him and allowed him to continue writing. And meantime, when he arrived at Phoenix, there had been enough stories nationally that the Phoenix reporters were all waiting at the gate to interview him when he arrived, which was exactly what they were trying to avoid. They were trying to hide him. And the first reporter who got into him from a Phoenix paper said, I think it was the Arizona Republic, said, you're a bank robber. What right do you have to write for a newspaper? And Danny replied, according to his story, I committed bank robbery and I was sent to prison, and that was right. And then I committed journalism and I was sent to the hole, and that was wrong. That became the title of our book, Committing Journalism. So this continued. It was a long court case. There were ups and downs. Ultimately, they when a court hearing went against them at the appeals level, the Federal Bureau of Prisons quickly went to a judge and said, wait a minute, the whole case is moot. They didn't want it decided on the basis of that hearing because it was clear that Danny was not guilty of any of the charges. So they basically wiped out the case and released him on parole.
Oh, wow.
And just to get rid of the case. He'd been in prison for, I don't know, in that stretch, maybe a decade. And then this was all quickly done. As soon as they learned what went on at the court hearing was a travesty of justice. I mean, it was clear that this was a First Amendment violation, that prisoners are punished for writing in the press, but not for writing other things. So it's specifically related to the news media, which are mentioned in the regulations that they cited. And so it was a clear violation of First Amendment. Anytime you have a law that applies only to the news media to suppress news, that's illegal under the Constitution. And so that's the case kind of frittered out over the years with that resolution. And ultimately, Danny was released. He went back a few times for minor parole violations, usually drugs. As anyone knows who's involved in this, it's a lifelong disease.
Yeah.
And ultimately got out and was living on his own in Alabama and enjoying his family, his grandchildren. And when he died at the age of 73 or something, a few years ago.
This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit the website at www.chnorcal.org. We also have the link on the bio. Now, your second book was Decca, The Letters of Jessica Mitford, and this is the one that I had heard of you from when it came out, because it was a very popular book. Can we talk about this book a little bit and how you came to work on it?
Sure. I had known Jessica Mitford. Let me just first say who Jessica Mitford was, because a lot of people don't know her. She lived in Oakland, right at the Berkeley border on Regent Street, a few blocks from where I live. And she was born an aristocrat, the daughter of Lord and Lady Redesdale in England, on an estate with a summer house, the whole thing, with a townhouse and a summer house. His father was in the House of Lords. And he was a crusty old character. These were real old English characters. And they had a quirky, she had 6 sisters.
Right.
And 1 brother, and they were raised, the sisters were not allowed to go to schools because girls were taught at home.
Right.
And so received minimal education. And they were raised by this crusty Lord Redesdale. And but each of them became well known in her own way. Two of them during World War II became notorious fascists. One was married to Sir Oswald Mosley, had an affair for years with, and then married Sir Oswald Mosley when his wife died. And she was a friend of Hitler, and as many of the English aristocracy was, and had spent time in Munich. Another sister, younger, was also a fan of Hitler and a groupie of Hitler, as it were. And when the war broke out, when Germany went to war, she moved to Munich and dined with Hitler. And on the day Germany declared war on England, she went to the English Garden in Munich and shot herself in the head.
Oh my God.
Survived in a kind of infantile state, Hitler took the best care of her, sent her to the top hospitals, and then put her on a train back to England. There were riots on the docks when she arrived, and she died a few years later from the effects of her wound. So she was a total groupie. It was unity. Jessica, whose family nickname was Decca, known that way to friends, went the opposite way. She became a communist, eloped with a friend whom she barely knew, another aristocrat who was Winston Churchill's nephew, to the Spanish Civil War to report on the war. England, under her father's influenced by her father, sent a troop ship to make sure she came to pick her up and take her home, as any good lord would do for his daughter.
Right.
And she and her partner and then husband got off in southern France and reported on the war from southern France for a while, and then moved back to England. When they were afraid, as everyone was, that England would go fascist, because a lot of the aristocracy were Nazis, fascists, they came to the United States, and it was kind of a aristocrats tour, but they stayed. They
Right.
went around the country with letters of introduction to people like Catherine Graham. These were well-born people and with connections, so they arrived with letters of introduction, and they became friendly with Catherine Graham, and her father, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, and other well-known Americans. It's a long story, and it's all told in the book, and it's hard to summarize. But her husband, when England declared war on Germany, and they knew which side it would be on in the war, her husband went to Canada, joined the Royal Canadian Air Force to fight the fascists, and was killed, lost on a mission in World War II, just before Decca was to take off there with their then daughter. Decca then stayed in New Deal, Washington, with some people that high-born people, American aristocracy, as it were, who were in the New Deal administration, the Durs, and knew people like John Kenneth Galbraith and all of those people from the circles that they moved in.
Yeah.
And ultimately met a radical Jewish attorney whom she married, Jewish attorney, at a time when her sisters were two of the most notorious fascists in the world. The sister who survived the war was sent with her husband Oswald Mosley to prison by their second cousin Winston Churchill, who was prime minister.
Right.
So it was these were all well-born people who were on different sides. And Decca then moved to Oakland, San Francisco, joined the Communist Party. She got married to her husband, Bob Truhaft, who became a well-known radical attorney in Oakland. She joined the Communist Party. They both joined the Communist Party for maybe 15 years, and mostly to do civil rights work in Oakland. They were among the civil rights pioneers of Oakland.
Right.
I don't know how far you want me to go with the story.
Well, they didn't they refused to testify in the House Anti-American Committee.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a McCarthy era, and at that point they were no longer in the party, but they refused on principle to say that they weren't.
Yeah.
But Decca had a wicked wit, as all the sisters did, and she really confused the committee so much they didn't know what to do with her, because she kept replying facetiously to their comments. At one point, they asked her whether she was a member of the Berkeley Tenants Unit, and she said she thought they were saying tennis club. So she completely flustered them by saying she doesn't play tennis. And just they became very frustrated. There was no outcome to that, really. And then they were, big supporters of the free speech movement at Cal. And I met Decca. So you asked me how I got involved. I
Right.
met Decca when she was interested in a project I was working on back in the 60s, an investigative journalism project, and called me up and said, I'm so interested in this. Will you come and tell me about it? And so I remained friends, acquaintances with them for decades. They were at my wedding back in 1971. I was at their 50th anniversary years later. And when she died, a few years after she died, Bob, her husband, called me one day and said, we'd like you to do Decca's letters. I said, what letters? I didn't even know she was a voluminous correspondent, as in the English tradition of waking up every morning and taking care of the day's correspondence. And he said, well, I've got some of the letters here. A lot of them are in archives, but if you want to come to the house and take a look, come on by. So I dropped by and I saw these amazing letters to Maya Angelou, who was a friend, to
Wow.
Catherine Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post later, celebrated in the Pentagon Papers era.
Yeah.
She had contacts all over the world and friends all over the world. And the letters were funny, smart, incisive. And I said, yeah, I'm interested in this.
Yeah.
And then that began a several-year project to gather the letters, edit them. The book ended up 700 some odd pages, but far too many letters to include.
Yeah.
Even then, I had to trim it down from 3 or 4 times that size to just from the initial candidates. So it involved and a lot of footnoting because people need to hear the history behind things. So it was a major effort over, I would say, 3 years, and was published by Knopf. Very well received all over the world.
Oh, yes.
And unfortunately never published as a paperback. Maybe that will still come. There's someone who is working that, people don't buy thick hardbacks anymore. And there's a woman who's working on Decca's biography, and there may be some interest in the paperback being issued at that time as a companion to the biography. The author of that biography is a well-known scholar and has really based a lot of her work on what I did. So she's a big fan of the letters book too.
I would love to see it re-released as a paperback because it's a wonderful work, and her story is very fascinating. Very fascinating American person.
Thank you. Yeah, she also became, I didn't mention this, an investigative reporter with a number of books that are a combination of investigative reporting and cutting wit. And really, she reduced some of her targets to nothing with her caustic wit.
Well, I knew her before I knew her story. I knew of her from The American Way of Death, which was a huge success.
Yeah, The American Way of Death was a phenomenon in 1963 to such an extent that Scribner, the publisher, was reordering paper every day because they just couldn't keep up with the demand. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for, I think, a year. And that's how many people do know her. She's also done some memoirs. American Way of Death is about the less about death than about the funeral industry and their predatory habits, and really the scandalous way that they milk especially low-income families for elaborate funerals that are not needed and elaborate arrangements. So she taking advantage of their grief, and she just was withering in her critique, and really from that point You can see graphs of embalmments going way, way down, and
Right.
it had a major impact on the country.
Oh, absolutely. Now, you are also a photographer, and you're very well known in the Bay Area for your photography. And you have a upcoming art exhibit at Alliant International University Hurwitz Library. Can you tell us about your photography, how you got interested in photography and what you do and why you do it?
Yeah, I take issue with only one thing there. I'm not so sure I'm a well-known photographer, but the exhibit is a major exhibit. It's my first solo show. I've been in a group show that was juried, but not a solo show. So this is a very exciting project for me. This is a late life passion. I've become much more passionate about photography in recent years. It started, I suppose, in my travels when I would take photographs and I would come back and I would say, some of these are not bad. Just I was using a point and shoot. I had never been much of a photographer as a kid. I dabbled with it, but not much. And then I had grandchildren. I started taking photographs of them and trying to capture their personalities, not just what they looked like, smiling, saying cheese for the camera, but trying to really capture who they were. And that was exciting. And we used to print them and put them on a wall. We have a wall full of grandchildren pictures. And over time, I just became more and more interested. I would graduate up from point and shoot. At some point, I realized I could get a lot more out of this camera if I understood manual controls, f-stops and ISO and so forth. And so I challenged myself to buy a manual control camera. And a friend, meanwhile, a neighbor who got interested in my photography, he was a photographer and was impressed with my eye. And he became like a mentor to me and used to send me late night emails saying, don't forget, if your ISO is set at this point, it has this effect and so forth. And at some point I said to him, I'm hitting the wall with this camera. I need to get hitting the ceiling. I need to get something with a little more capacity. He would direct me to the right camera. A simultaneous feature was that I became more disabled as a result of 7 spinal surgeries.
Right.
And I felt I was aging. I'm 80 years old now, and I felt my range of movement was constricted. I couldn't walk well. I often use a wheelchair. I sometimes can walk with a walking sticks for a short distance, cane, but I'm definitely constricted, and I felt constricted. And I used to take the camera with me. It helped me on walks because I'm very unstable. It helped me to take my mind off the pain of walking, of being upright, and distract me. And so it was something I just took to doing, is taking the camera with me and seeing what I could photograph. And my mentor also said, a photographer always has their camera with them because it's the unexpected moments you're trying to capture. And I found that the photos I took and that developing my photography felt like a way of combating the constriction I felt from the physical constriction of the disability.
Right.
And age. It opened things up. I think older people need and often find creative outlets late in life. And it seems a compensatory mechanism and a salutary one to be free to create and to find and shoot. And so I just, over time, it became more and more important. I started, in addition to going up in cameras, my mentor challenged me to shoot in the raw format, which everyone knows JPEGs, but that JPEG is kind of a approximation of what the camera is, all the information that's coming into the camera. It's an algorithm that decides this is what you mean to say with all this information, this light and dark information we're registering on the sensor. The raw photo is much more data. It's everything that the camera has. And then there's raw photo editors that you can use to bring out the features of the photo that you would like or not. So it's a more sophisticated way of editing. And these days, editing is a big part of post photo, call it post processing. After you take the photo, a lot of what happens no longer in the dark room, but in the computer.
Right.
And so once you learn raw editing, you're taking it to another level. And so I did that, and then he got me on Photoshop, and I developed those skills and found really a wonderful world that a wonderful way of capturing and commenting on the world, or processing it. It used to be that I would go for walks and I would come back and I'd say, well, I didn't see anything worth photographing. Over time, as your eye becomes acclimated, and the name of the exhibit at Alliant International University is the attentive eye. You begin to see differently. You see things that you had missed in just walking past it. And sooner really, I would stop for flowers or blades of grass or anything that looked interesting in shape and character, or the light hit it in a certain way, and I could see something I couldn't see before, when I just sort of generalized what I was viewing instead of looking at particularity. And a number of the photos in the exhibit are macro photos of literally blades of grass, but they have a world all their own, and when you blow them up, it's almost magical, and you increase you become more actively engaged with your environment in a way. So I loved it, and I still do, and I'm excited about the exhibit.
I love what I love about your photography is it reminds me of how much I miss day to day. I oftentimes will go on autopilot in my day to day. I get up, I shave, I shower, I drink coffee, I go to work, I leave work, I go home, I go to the grocery store, watch TV, blah, yada, yada. And like, I know that if I stop and take a walk and I actually take the time, I will notice things I didn't notice before. And I think your work really brings that home. Was that your intent, do you think?
Yes, or at least it's the effect of what I did. I became more conscious of doing that later on. But yes, that's exactly what process I was describing. And in fact, I've used a different term, but the term I use is we speed read life.
Right.
We miss some of the beauty and the character of our world by what we have to do. We have to live with habits. We as I will say in a talk I'm giving at Alliant, we can't relearn toothbrushing every night.
Right.
Some of it is just relegated to habit, and that's how we survive. But we also need to reestablish some connection, more immediate connection with the world, and that's what I meant by the attentive eye, is exactly what you were just describing. A greater awareness and engagement with and openness to the world, so that there's a great variety in what I see, and that's reflected in the exhibit. It's not a photo, it's not a flower show, it's not a buildings or landscape show or a street photography show. It's all of them, the above.
I really love the beauty in your photography of people as well. You really capture something. I think there's there's a definite randomness in a lot of your photos that you catch people unguarded and you see the beauty in people. Was that your intent too, to kind of show like that kind of unposed beauty?
I think we all see that in people, but there's a real thrill in capturing it.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, I throw away probably 95% of the photos I take of people because I'm looking for that unguarded moment when they are themselves. I like to say that I like to capture people acting human as they so often do.
Yeah.
and they, you know, we all have those unguarded moments when we really are ourselves and authentic, and children are less skilled at guarding them than
Right.
adults. So often children exhibit it much more than adults, and a lot of my photos are of children, mostly grandchildren, but some that are not, and a number that are not. But adults too, you can catch them in a moment, and what I want is not the posed moment. I don't want the cheese moment.
Yeah.
I want to see them be themselves. And so often I click the shutter just before or just after someone else might have, because it's not what you see when someone poses, it's what you see when they're unguarded, when they let down their guard and just be themselves. And there's a real beauty in people. I love people when they allow themselves to be themselves.
I think one thing I really like about your work, especially the work with nature, is that we're oftentimes reminded to go be in nature to kind of help balance our, you know, our serotonin levels and like kind of acclimate, get our brain in a good space. And I think when I look at a lot of your photographs, I always think it's a reminder to get back in nature, the really good stuff I'm missing by not spending time there and not paying attention. And you, I think, remind us of what we're missing with both the nature and the human beings that you photograph. You're reminding us of what we're not paying attention to and the stuff that's all around us. And I really think that's very special.
Thank you. It's a joy to take part in that process. I mean, there's as much joy in taking the photo and capturing something as there is in talking about it or seeing it later as a photograph. So I appreciate that. I feel the same thing as, and a lot of it is macro. I mean, the camera can see some places where we can't. I mean, there are some grasses or grains that I've photographed just in the weed strips next to between the sidewalk and the street. And if you look closely at some of them, they are graceful, gorgeous, beautifully designed. If you look at the innards of a flower, suddenly you see a whole world of organization and of beauty that we really don't suspect is there when we just see it in a field from afar or something. Nature has such amazing design, and we are a part of it, and we need to feel both the chaos and the design all around us, and both the haphazard and the beautiful, and all those, calling attention to those freezes a moment, a moment, and brings it to you in a way that you can't get from only experiencing it.
Yeah. Peter, I'm going to put a link on the bio for our listeners, and I'm going to encourage them strongly to go look at some of your artwork online. And if they're in the Bay Area, when we have the exhibit, I'm urging them strongly to come see the exhibit because they're really going to get a lot out of that. I also
you.
am going to put links in the bio to your 2 books. So I really want to recommend people look at Decca, The Letters of Jessica Mitford, and also Committing Journalism, The Prison Writings of Red Hog, with prison writer Danny M. Martin. So Peter, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed having you as a guest here. I hope we get to have you back again.
I appreciate it, Dean. I appreciate your making those connections between different parts of my life and endeavor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll go. That was my conversation with Peter Sussman, author of Decca, The Letters of Jessica Mitford. On Friday, we're going to have chef and restaurateur Tamara Dyson on the program. She'll be speaking with us then. I look forward to talking to Tamara, and I hope you all have a great afternoon and keep cooking.